On December 3rd, 1854, a handful of diggers stood up to an unjust and corrupt government administration. The resulting battle is said to have defined us as a nation. But what did the diggers hope to achieve? Did they really expect to prevail against the superior British Army? And was the result worth the ultimate sacrifice many were to pay? In 1851, gold was discovered in the infant colony of Victoria, triggering an influx of fortune seekers from around the world. Many flocked to the gold-rich settlement of Ballarat, 150 kilometres northwest of Melbourne. In response to massive migration to the interior, the government established a gold commission to administer the goldfields. The commissioners were responsible for law and order in the rapidly growing settlements. They were also responsible for enforcing the unpopular and exorbitant miner's licence.
You needed the development of a system of law and order. Now that had already been established by virtue of the Gold Commission on the goldfields in New South Wales, and so it was then done here. And that not only implied, but meant the immediate imposition of a licence fee. Virtually a tax on the labour of the diggers, irrespective of whether they found gold or not.
The licence gave a digger the right to mine a 12-foot square claim for 30 shillings per month. Local police, affectionately known as Joes by the diggers, enforced compliance. Many were ex-convicts, corrupt and resentful of the diggers. Merciless in their hunts, the diggers felt humiliated and degraded by the constant harassment.
It was the way this tax was administered by a mounted police force inspecting people's licences at the point of a bayonet. This was not the way British justice was usually administered, and this was what really upset the diggers.
By 1854, the easy-to-acquire alluvial gold was becoming scarce. Diggers had to sink exploratory shafts to trace ancient riverbeds, a technique known as deep-lead mining. This was a slow, uncertain and sometimes dangerous process. Frustration grew in late 1854 when the newly elected governor, Sir Charles Hotham, ordered licence hunts to be doubled to twice a week, putting even more pressure on the embattled diggers.
And he was told that he was to enforce the licence fee even if it came to a fight, and he was equally told that the 12th Regiment would be sent out at the cost paid by Victoria, incidentally, their transport, their food and whatever else, to make it sure that if it came to a fight, then the reinforcements were there available to the governor.
Amongst the many hopefuls was a young 27-year-old Irishman, Peter Lalor. A civil engineer by trade, Lalor worked on the Melbourne to Geelong Railroad before moving to Ballarat in search of gold.
Peter Lalor came from Tetherkill in what was then Queen's County in Ireland. His father had been a member of the British Parliament. The Lalors were a fairly well-off farming family, and Peter had been very well educated for the times. So he came from not a radical background, although one of his brothers was a very radical activist in the 1848 rebellion in Ireland. But Peter had seemed to be a fairly quiet engineer until he suddenly stepped forward and for a brief moment took the lead at Eureka and then quietly settled back into a fairly conservative life.
Given Peter Lalor's background, it's not surprising he was soon to become a major player in the struggle against oppression. Unseasonably hot weather had affected the Ballarat goldfields. Tempers were short and the settlement's many grog houses bore a roaring trade.
Events really came to a head with the burning of Bentley's hotel in Ballarat in October 1854. And this event was caused when a young Scotsman was murdered outside the hotel, and popular belief was that it was the owner of the hotel who had murdered the young Scotsman.
Bentley, an ex-Van Diemensian convict, or Van Diemen's Land of course, had prospered sufficiently. I think he was a confectioner in Melbourne. Now where he in fact got the money to put up the best, biggest hotel on the goldfields of Ballarat, I don't know. But obviously one of the people associated with him was the magistrate Jewish. He was an accomplice financially, partner to an extent in the Eureka Hotel, which I should say also was the most disreputable institution of its kind in the whole of Ballarat. Jewish was on the bench a few days after the killing of Scobie when Bentley was let off.
And so the men basically got together and had a protest meeting, and they were going to petition the government yet again to try to get a proper investigation into this murder. And it was at that point that the crowd somehow got out of control and somebody started throwing stones and the hotel was burnt.
What you had was an outrage again against human rights, the cover-up of it by the authorities, and the clear stand that the authorities took, as it were, to protect the person whom everyone knew to have been responsible. That incidentally was the first time that the name Peter Lalor came to the fore at all. He was on a little committee that, as it were, was organising this protest. So that it was one of the sparks, but I think that even then, had the provocation not continued over those final weeks, particularly with the increase in the hunts and that last one, there would have been no Eureka.
3 diggers were arrested and the mob dispersed at gunpoint. The riot prompted Commissioner Reid to request reinforcements. Fearing an attack on the camp was imminent, fortifications were established and access was limited.
At no stage did the diggers ever show any inclination, wish, or whatever you want to call it, to attack the camp, to attack the government authorities, much less to overthrow the authority of the Queen in the colony of Victoria, and finally, much less to set up a government of their own. What they came to do was stand here for their human rights and their human dignity.
If not for the efforts of moderates such as John Humphrey, editor of the Ballarat Leader and outspoken critic of the government system, Reid's fears could have been realised. Humphrey helped form the Ballarat Reform League, an organisation that attempted to settle the diggers' grievances through negotiation. They met several times with Commissioner Reid in an attempt to head off violent confrontation.
So an organisation called the Ballarat Reform League came into being, and it organised a platform, organised mass meetings, and particularly a meeting on the 11th of November 1854 when over 10,000 people gathered on Bakery Hill, and they affirmed a platform of political rights, of democratic rights, and this was the charter of the Ballarat Reform League. I think it's one of the most important documents in Australian history.
On November 28th, events took a turn for the worst. As reinforcements arrived from Geelong, they were set upon by the diggers. Unarmed and ill-prepared for the ambush, several soldiers were injured. The diggers believed the soldiers carried artillery, which would have given the military a decisive advantage. Wagons were overturned and searched, but no heavy weapons were found.
You have the concomitants of two things. One, a deliberate series of provocative acts on the part of the government. Two, the response of the diggers, which was exactly what was wanted, because that's what happened. They caught them with arms in their hands and they put down the democratic movement at one blow in the blood of 30 diggers and, of course, 5 soldiers who were doing no more than their duty.
Tension was increasing. Conflict seemed inevitable. The diggers gathered on Bakery Hill within sight of the government camp to air their grievances. The Southern Cross was unveiled for the first time and flew defiantly in the breeze. The Ballarat Reform League reported its failure to obtain any undertakings from Governor Hotham, and in open defiance, the diggers burnt licences. They agreed to resist police and to protect defaulting diggers. Reid saw control slipping from his hands. In an effort to reaffirm his authority, he ordered a licence hunt the following day. 8 diggers were found without licences and promptly arrested. Before long, a crowd of diggers had surrounded the police, preventing them from returning to the camp.
On the 30th of November, and clearly with the concurrence of the Governor, there was a last licence hunt. 8 diggers were arrested. The Gold Commissioners came out accompanied by police and the military with bayonets. And I think I'd have to say, you weren't dealing with an uneducated group of vagabonds in the diggers. The education generally of the diggers here on Ballarat, or in Ballarat, was higher than that generally in the British Isles. And furthermore, because of the nature of gold mining, let's call it that here, in which it would take you perhaps 6 months to get down to a lead, there was stability. Diggers were building their homes. There were wives and children. Ballarat itself was a stable community with theatres and hotels and newspapers and the beginning of a hospital, etc. So he wasn't dealing with vagabonds. So that for civilians to see that the law was being enforced at the point of bayonet was an anathema to these men.
The local administration had seen all these licences being burnt, so it was a most provocative act to send out troopers and soldiers for a licence inspection the next morning. That then led to another meeting, and this is where Peter Lalor steps forward as a leader of the diggers, and he stands on a stump, and under the flag of the Southern Cross, the Eureka flag, which had made its first appearance the day before, he calls upon the diggers around him to take up arms. He calls on them to take an oath under the flag, to swear, to fight, to defend their rights and liberties. This was basically an act of provocation, a declaration of war, if you like.
We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties.
Divisions and brigades were formed, firearms and provisions collected. The men then marched in column to what was later to be known as the Eureka Stockade. The stockade was approximately 1 acre, crudely fortified by overturned wagons and shaft timber. On a natural slope, it was backed by Melbourne Road and thick forest. In its heart, amongst tents and newly worked claims, flew the symbol of the miners' defiance, the Southern Cross.
The tactics of the diggers in gathering in a stockade where they made themselves a sitting target does not seem a very brilliant military strategy from someone like Peter Lalor, who's trained in engineering. In fact, they could have conducted a guerrilla campaign much more successfully amongst all of those shafts and holes.
Now armed, in an open defiance of the law, military conflict seemed inevitable.
Looking like they wanted to fight has got to be seen in the light of that is exactly what the government wanted them to look like. Successfully wanted them to look like. And therefore you ask yourself, what were the diggers doing? Well, essentially, I repeat, the diggers came to the stockade. It was one place in which they could say, you are not going to come here and conduct licence hunts. That's the first thing, because that was the ultimate and primary grievance. The licence accompanied, of course, with the licence hunts. And remember, I think, we've got to remember, these diggers had no representation in Parliament. They could neither vote nor stand. They couldn't go onto the land because the land was still locked in the embrace of the squatters. Literally, they had nowhere to go. And they knew, because they weren't all fools, that in the end the goal would run thin.
But the diggers' conviction was wavering. By Saturday, December the 2nd, many had left the stockade, disillusioned by the lack of organisation and direction of the uprising. Appropriately, the password for access to the stockade was Vinegar Hill, a prophecy of bitter conflict which lay ahead. At 3 a.m. on December 3rd, a raiding party consisting of 279 soldiers, police and civilians quietly left the government camp heading north. They marched to the base of Black Hill and swung around to the approach of the stockade from the northwest. A scout on Black Hill fired a warning shot. The element of surprise was lost. By dawn, the troopers had reached the stockade. The mounted police took up positions to the west, foot police to the north. But the first strike was reserved for the storming party comprising of cavalry and foot soldiers from the 12th and 40th regiments. There was a great cheer, and the troops, with bayonets fixed, charged the stockade. The hastily built fortifications proved little object to the advancing soldiers. The stockaders fought hand to hand against the advancing forces, but outnumbered and outclassed, the diggers were soon routed. In the initial volley, Peter Lalor's left arm was shattered. Too weak to continue, he was hidden in a mine shaft and later escaped. His arm was so badly damaged, it was amputated.
The descendants of those who fought at the stockade carry with them many stories of how their ancestors helped Peter Lalor to escape by hiding him under piles of slabs, by hiding him under a baby's cot, by hiding him under a woman's dress. There are lots of stories about that.
The police pursued the fleeing rebels through the woods to the rear of the stockade, shooting both guilty and innocent men on sight. The battle lasted only 20 minutes. It took the lives of 35 diggers, wounded countless others, 4 troopers were killed and 12 others were wounded.
There were poignant moments immediately after it was over. A little dog was on the chest of a digger who had, I think, 15 bayonet wounds in his body. Well, you know, you don't take that many to kill a man, do you? And he wouldn't leave it. And he was wailing, and they threw the body into a cart, and the little dog jumped into the cart after his master.
There was a public outcry in Melbourne over the excessive use of force. In subsequent trials, those captured at the stockade were released and an amnesty was ordered by Governor Hotham for the leaders of the rebellion. An inquiry was set up to investigate the fiasco. It was scathing in its criticism of the Goldfields administration and recommended sweeping changes. The miner's licence was replaced by an export duty and the miner's right with a small annual fee. Political representation was also given to the diggers. Both Peter Lalor and John Humphrey both went on to represent Ballarat in the Victorian Parliament.
I think what Eureka does in Australia, in Ballarat, is to unleash very strong radical energy, which certainly ensures that a rapid series of democratic gains are won by the people of Victoria, and indeed we see these democratic gains reflected in the Australian Constitution of 1901.
Out of defeat came victory for the diggers. At great cost, they achieved political voice and equality.
The diggers were here because they believed that all political power fundamentally comes from the people. And they were here because they believed in a fair go. They were here because they believed in human rights. They were here because they believed that they should have a hand in the making of the laws that they were called upon to obey, and they were prepared to die for it. And to me, that is the heart of democracy.